Welcome. Today we're going to explore another aspect of the history of the Kalamazoo area. You might even say the final aspect. This is a discussion of death and dying in historic Kalamazoo. Nowadays, in our modern society, we tend to shunt thoughts of death and dying aside and bury people and more or less forget about them. It's unusual to visit graveyards, but it was not so in the 19th century. Cemeteries were a popular place for people to go and reflect and think about the departed. And now, these cities of the dead, as you could call them, can serve as a reminder of the history of Kalamazoo. In essence, they're a living museum of the past. And we can look at the tombstones and read some of the inscriptions and look at the architecture of the tombstones and learn a good deal about earlier Kalamazoo. For example, people in the 19th century practiced some things that we might consider morbid by modern circumstances. They kept souvenirs of funerals. For example, I have here a plate that was off a coffin. It says "Our Darling" on it, and before the deceased was interred, relatives might take this off the casket and keep it as a memory of the funeral. Inscriptions on tombstones were very important, and they were picked with care. I have here a little volume that was put out by Johnson & Sherman of Kalamazoo. They were a tombstone manufacturer, and they lettered tombstones for people. And this was published in 1867, and it's filled with selections appropriate for various people. Evidently, the original owner of this lost a young child because they have starred selections appropriate for a young child. For example, "Sleep on, sweet babe, and take thy rest. God called you home, he thought it best." Poetry was very common to find in association with funerals. I think 19th century people had more time on their hands. They also seemed to have more of a flair for poetry. And so when someone died, rather than a typical verbal obituary, somebody would dash off a poem about them. Here, for example, is lines on the death of Julia Ann, wife of Alexander Patterson, who died November 13th, 1882 of consumption, aged 33 years. This is an obituary of Susan B. Southwell, who died in Allegan, Michigan in 1892, and it tells her life story in a sort of poetry. "The next to the oldest in a family of 10, she found plenty to do, to make and to mend, and while yet a young girl of her mother's bereft, a heavy burden on her frail hands was left." And it's not great poetry, but it does tell her life story. I mentioned the architecture of tombstones. It's very interesting because we can look at tombstones and they mirror many of the other artistic styles that were in vogue. For example, architecture changed every 20 years or so. We find the Greek Revival, the simple Greek Revival, the earliest architecture. We find tombstones from that era, the pre-Civil War era, that are reminiscent of the Greek Revival. For example, this tombstone here. It's very austere, plain, straight lines. It would be similar to the Empire-style furniture that was then in vogue at the time. We see the evolution of the style of tombstone. As houses change, for example, we find Victorian homes, Italianate, Queen Anne style. We find tombstone architecture changing also. In modern times, we find more modern ranch-style architecture, and we find tombstones that are similar to the other architectural things. I mentioned that a cemetery like Mountain Home, like this, can be a living museum, and the more you know about the history of Kalamazoo, the more you can look around here and see that this is the final resting place of many of the prominent citizens of Kalamazoo, but there's a story connected with almost every one of them. For example, over here I noticed the tombstone of Benjamin Orcutt. Benjamin Orcutt was a very prominent Civil War colonel from Kalamazoo, raised a local regiment and won fame during the Civil War, returned to his hometown and was appointed sheriff. One night in 1867, he left his home in pursuit of a burglar he had heard breaking in, and the burglar turned around and shot him dead. The local Grand Army of the Republic post was named in his honor. So that's just a little story connected with Benjamin Orcutt. We can wander a little bit around the cemetery and notice some other stories connected with Mountain Home Cemetery. This is one of the more prominent tombstones in Mountain Home Cemetery. It's the Allen plat. Oscar Allen was the founder of the Globe Casket Company that manufactured the caskets for generations here in Kalamazoo, downtown Kalamazoo, and his tombstone honors his vocation of the Globe Casket Company, and he's buried here along with other members of his family. The important thing to remember when you look at a tombstone, however, is that the year on the designation of death may not be the same year in which the tombstone was erected. You see, often tombstones were put up generations after the person had deceased. It was quite expensive to put up a tombstone. Sometimes families would save for 20, 30 years until they could buy a tombstone for the father or the uncle or whoever. You could even order tombstones out of the early Sears Roebuck catalogs, and some did. So beyond the individual tombstone, cemeteries like Mountain Home are interesting because as cities of the dead, they actually perpetuate many of the facets of cities themselves. For example, there are neighborhoods. There are better neighborhoods in Mountain Home and slummier neighborhoods. There are ethnic neighborhoods. There's a Jewish section, for example. This particular section that we're in here, I like to think of maybe as the industrial park, because as we look around us, we see the tombs of many of Kalamazoo's prominent industrialists. In addition to Oscar Allen, over here we see the Chapin, or the Chapin plot. Lawrence and Chapin Iron Works, the building that is now Vermeulen's on Rose Street. He was one of the founders of that. And as we look up, we see other prominent Kalamazoo manufacturers. Farther up there, that giant obelisk was erected by Joel Perrin. Joel Perrin himself did not achieve a great deal of fame. He was a merchant downtown Kalamazoo, but he certainly lives on in his monument, the largest monument in Mountain Home. Some cemeteries have military sections in which you find the rows of the government tombstones in line, just as you would find soldiers in rank. The tops of hills were better districts. I guess the idea was that the last sleeping place of the departed, they could have a nice view of the surrounding country. But as we walk around, we can see definitely the neighborhoods. The early neighborhoods, the pioneer section where the cemetery started would have the very simple tombs. And then as the suburban growth of the cemetery took off in the 1870s and 1880s, we would find Victorian-style tombstones. I'd like to show you some other tombstones over in the industrial section. Among the many nicknames Kalamazoo has had throughout the ages has been the Windmill City. In the 1870s, Kalamazoo was one of the nation's leading producers of windmills for agricultural purposes. And here we have the final resting place of a couple of Kalamazooans that helped make the city the windmill capital of the Midwest. B.S. Williams founded the Bradley Williams Company that manufactured windmills, very prominent, marketed them all over the country, and Homer Manville, a Civil War veteran, came back to Kalamazoo and founded the company that ultimately became the Kalamazoo Tank and Silo Company. Manufactured windmills and later on the country's first silos. In a prominent section of the cemetery here we find the Henderson plat, Henderson Taylor. Frank Henderson was the founder of the company that ultimately became Henderson Ames, one of the nation's leading producer of fraternal regalia, swords and things like that. In the 1890s he erected what we know as Henderson Castle across the street here, and it was completed in the 1898, 1899. Unfortunately, Frank Henderson died right when it was completed, but he was buried here with a beautiful view of his castle. Right next to him, this is Frank's grave here, is the grave of his son, James Henderson, who was in the Spanish-American War. This is a typical government tombstone that was supplied to veterans free of cost if they chose to have the rather austere military tombstone. There's an interesting connection. While his son was in the Spanish-American War, Frank Henderson, unfortunately his company that is, was involved in a scandal that rocked Michigan. He had bought some surplus military uniforms very cheaply before the Civil War, and the need for uniforms for Michigan troops came up. Some of his company sewed new pinstriping on the side and sold it back to the government at brand new prices. Well, that leaked out, and it almost cost the governor of Michigan his job. Historians theorize the first tombstones were probably merely a stone put on a grave to keep animals from digging it up. But gradually we have seen tombstones get more and more sophisticated, reflecting each particular generation's ideals. This example from the 1850s or early 1860s has a shroud draped over it. Of course, the shroud being the covering of a corpse. Other examples are full of symbolism. We often see weeping willows on tombstones, and Grecian urns, and symbols of Christianity and things like that. Of course, there remained a definite need to keep not only animals but human beings from digging up the corpses in the 19th century. The medical schools needed bodies for research, for cutting up and finding how the human body worked, and they were not available any other way than by the use of resurrectionists, people that would frequent cemeteries after someone had been buried, dig the body up in the quiet of the night, and sell it to a medical school. The University of Michigan in Ann Arbor needed to procure corpses that same way. And so there became a custom of trying to keep this from happening. Naturally, nobody wanted to have their dearly departed end up as a cadaver in a medical school. And so people would guard tombstones at night until the body had become of no use to medical science. And they even sometimes put torpedoes down in with the casket so that if somebody dug them up, they'd all be blown up. Another great fear of the time was of being buried alive, a la Edgar Allan Poe, for example. And entrepreneurs patented devices that would make sure that if you did wake up while buried, that you could alert people up above that there was something wrong, you were still alive. And so they would put in the hands of a deceased a rope that could trigger a bell signaling those above that, yes, I'm still alive, dig me up, or a flag, or various things like that. Here we find an example of a modernistic tombstone from the 1940s, 1944. Rush McNair, Dr. Rush McNair, came to Kalamazoo in 1887 and wrote his memoirs in the 1930s, and a beautiful description of the history of medicine in Kalamazoo. I've read the memoirs, and he comes across as a very kind gentleman, someone that I would really have liked to have known. There's one very tragic episode of his life, however. He was a medical doctor himself, but he had a 7-year-old son that needed a tonsillectomy, and he brought in a specialist from Chicago, the best doctor available, and they operated, and despite having the specialist there, something went wrong, and the youth died on the operating table. Rush McNair, grief-stricken, picked up his dead son and rushed out of the hospital, just absolutely insane with grief, and he never forgot that, naturally. And here we find the tombstone of Rush McNair, and he's buried with his 7-year-old son. Part of the lure of wandering cemeteries is the adventure of finding mysteries. I don't know a thing about what happened here other than that it's the statue of a dog, a faithful dog, evidently guarding a tombstone. Here we find an example of a tombstone from 1866 that mirrors the architectural style then popular, the Italianate. If you think back about Italianate architecture, the windows were rounded on top, arched, and here we see the same effect with the tombstone. This is the tombstone of John Cadman, M.D., who was born in Norway, New York in 1803 and died in Kalamazoo in 1866. And his last words, "I want to go." Evidently he did. Beyond tombstones that represent the final resting place, there are many curious customs connected with the funeral itself, the social history of death and dying. And for that, I'd like to turn the program over to Lynn Houghton.
Death during the 19th century was a very personal item for people. People died at home, and funerals were held at home. They were quite an event. During the 19th century, it was very popular to send invitations to people. and you would send them gloves, which they would wear then at the funeral. We even have a photograph of a funeral that was held in the home. Photographs were used a lot during the mourning period, and there's one aspect of photographs, one area of photographs that sort of maybe gives us the willies, and that is photographing children who have died. But it's important to remember when we look at these photographs that for many people, that they didn't get their pictures taken that much. So for a lot of children, when they died, this was the only time that they would be photographed, either in their casket or in a carriage or in a bed. So that was something that was very popular back then. How to act after someone died was very important in the 19th century, and there were several etiquette books written on how widows, widowers, families, and all members of different families should act, whether your spouse passed away or your grandparent passed away. Another that was very popular during the time of the 19th century were memorial pictures. Some of these were produced by such famous firms as Currier and Ives. These were lithographs or etchings, and what you would usually get is you would get the picture, and then you would, if you'll excuse the expression, fill in the blanks with the appropriate name and dates and whatever of the death of your loved one. These pictures tend to be very romanticized, and it was a very romantic period. You would frame these and then hang them on your wall. Another popular type of picture was you would insert the photograph of your loved one and then the information underneath. Different artists would paint pictures of the family and then maybe off to the side paint a picture of a loved one that has passed away. So mourning pictures, different types of mourning pictures. There were also different types of memorial floral arrangements that you would have in your house. We have one here that was in Kalamazoo. We're not too sure who it was, but we have the photo and we have the flowers, and this is something that you would have in your house, probably, of course, for the funeral, and then later. We have another one here that was also from Kalamazoo for a woman, and it was a very lavish picture with some lilies and the picture of a person. Another type of picture that was popular to do was to make a memorial picture made out of human hair. More than likely, in fact, mostly all the time, would be the hair from the deceased. Now, it's important when you think about and you talk about death in the 19th century to remember that the different customs and mores really varied from people to people, depending on their religious and their ethnic roots, and also especially where they were living at the time. If you lived on the frontier, you couldn't really spend that time in mourning. Also remember, during the 19th century, there was a lot of death, especially infant mortality, especially out in the frontier. So you couldn't really spend that much time, that many years mourning before you had to get back to work. So mourning really varied from person to person. Another thing we have here too, if you were in mourning, is you would use different types of things, including mourning pins. And these were just simply straight pins, and they have black heads, and we also have some white heads on here on the straight pins that you would use if you were doing your sewing afterwards. So there were all types of different types of articles to use and ways that you should behave, how you should invite someone to a funeral, what you should say to this person. Again, it was all tied up in the customs and the culture of the period. Now, another way that we would see mourning would be in the use of costuming. That was something that was more evident and people would see a lot of. And hello, Annette.
Hi, Lynn.
Now, we have you dressed up in a black outfit, I think for a very good reason, and that is to show what a mourning outfit would look like. I think we talked about, Annette, that this would be about the period, I think it was from about somewhere in the 19th century.
That's correct. Probably later 1900s dress.
Around the 1890s. Mm-hmm. Now, what you would be in was what would be considered real heavy mourning, where the woman would be totally dressed in black. I see you even have a mourning handkerchief.
That's right. There was all sorts of paraphernalia that went with your costume, but of course wearing black was the most important. It was a way of honoring the memory of a loved one, and most women wore black clothing for a period up to 2 years.
And that was another thing, too, that was determined so much by the custom of the time. A woman would wear it for 2 years, but it was interesting, Annette, that a man was only expected to wear it for 1 year. A little sexism back in the 19th century, because and there were some women that protested about that and didn't think that was very fair, that a man would only have to go half the time as a woman would. Now this would be sort of like the first degree of mourning. Then after 2 years, there would be different colors that women could wear, so they wouldn't be limited to black. I think there were even white.
White was popular, gray was popular, and also, I believe, purple would be another color that would be considered acceptable.
And isn't that interesting? We don't think of white as a mourning color, even though that was popular for children, too, in the 19th century to wear. You may not have the child wear black, but you could have them wear white, and so that would be considered mourning. As I mentioned, there were different degrees. For example, if your child died, you'd be in mourning for 6 months. If your parents died, maybe 3 months. So it varied. Now you're wearing a very beautiful brooch. Do you know what that is made out of?
Well, this brooch is made out of onyx, and onyx was considered the appropriate material that your jewelry could be made out of. And of course, women like to adorn themselves, and for that reason, you could put a brooch on like this and be considered within the norm of dress during mourning.
Yeah, that was, I never knew of onyx as being black. I don't know my gems, my stones as well as I thought I would. That was probably one of the only things that they could wear, or another type of jewelry they could wear, which I don't think you'll find too much in the jewelry stores these days. And that is, you could wear jewelry, but it could either be onyx or jet. And I don't know if that's a form of onyx or not. I'm not too sure if jet black is or not. Or you could wear, like what I have here in my hand, hair jewelry made from the deceased, which, when you look at it, this is a cross, Annette. I can't believe the workmanship that went into something like this. It looks like it was made by just single strands of hair. And but I'm sure that you were so bereaved at the time that you would not mind spending time to make something like this to wear.
Well, it's also interesting, too, for people to note that the material hair seems like a very soft material that you couldn't shape into these forms, but people had recipes for soaking the hair, and it would then take on a very stiff appearance and could be then shaped in any way that you'd like, flowers, and in this case, in rounded shapes.
That is unusual. And then I know that we mentioned about how they even have memorial pictures made out of hair, too.
That's right.
So it was really almost like an artistic kind of thing to do back then, was to do that. The other things that we have here, women would always wear hats. They could not leave without a bonnet or a hat or a veil. And that material is interesting. It's crepe material, rather rough.
It is, and it's different from what you would think of as a net or a standard veil material, but it was thicker, and it probably had a little bit more body than a net would.
I think it did, but then one of the complaints about the net, or about the crepe, which you might see in that bonnet right there, Annette, is sometimes it would rust. And there were some women that would complain about wearing crepe because they would feel that it would smell, it would rust, and it was just not a very comfortable kind of material to wear. And here we have just a crepe hat, which they would probably adorn with a veil. Well, you know, wearing black, we don't really see that too much anymore for funerals and for mourning. In fact, the whole practice of mourning has really changed so much in today's society. And I think that's tied in with the change in our attitudes towards death towards the 20th century, and that is death is not personal anymore. People will go to a hospital to die instead of dying at home. People don't have funerals at homes anymore like the Kalamazoo house here. And it's the attitude that you are to pick up and move on to something else. And I think that probably changed. I don't want people to think that we're not living in a romantic time now, But don't you think, too, it's just a different attitude?
I do. I think people were a lot more formal, and they expressed themselves to the public in a different way. They always wanted to make sure that their feelings were known to the community, and honoring a person through their dress was an important thing to do.
And not only in dress, but in the way that they would act, and in the practices and things that they would decorate their house with, too. So it was just tied in with how the life was, how everyday life was back then.